This tutorial is actually part of a 4-part series that I made on my Patreon. This is the first part. I thought it would be valuable to put it on YouTube and see how it does over here. There's a lot of good stuff in this tutorial, and I know that this kind of classic way of using Octane scatter to create nature scenes is a little bit dated now, and a lot of you probably want to see it in Redshift. So if you do want to see something similar in Redshift, then let me know. But in this 4-part series, I'm basically breaking down my nature workflow, and with each part, we're getting more complicated. We're adding more things into the scenes and showing you how I make a lot of my renders in this style. So if you want to go check out the other 3 parts, then you can do. You can just sign up with a free trial on my Patreon and go watch them all. The project files are also up there. And like I said, through the different parts, it gets more complicated, and we start adding more and more variations into the scenes and developing it more and more. So I hope you enjoy this tutorial. I hope it does well here, and be sure to go check out the rest of the parts on my Patreon. So I want to do a little mini series just exploring how I create different grass variations like this. I'm going to slowly make it more complicated over the next few tutorials. But today I just want to concentrate how we can get simple grass formations like this, not really much variation besides the actual grass, how we can deal with varying them, how we can deal with balancing this in the composition and making it look nice, and keeping it nice and scaled. And then in the coming weeks, I'll go over a couple different versions as well, like adding in more variation and creating more and more complex renders. So when it comes to actually creating these renders, I feel like most people tend to overcomplicate the process and seem to overcompensate their workflow with trying to add in new nuances or thinking that these scenes are created differently to a lot of other scenes, when in reality they're generally quite straightforward and we're generally using a lot of the same techniques, although there is a couple of tricks that we can use that really sell these scenes. But once you get them down, it gets pretty easy to retain that habit of creating them. So we're just going to create the grass. Generally, one thing I do want to go over though is I'd like to use Forester for creating these grass scattering scenes. Although I do use Megascans a lot as well. I think Forester gets better results, but these kind of grass assets you can get almost the exact same result with. The main difference is with Forester, for example, here we have all of these different grass setups in Megascans. We could take one clump of grass in Forester and expand the grass patch radius out to kind of any of these different variables at will without having to swap in and out different assets. And I prefer that workflow quite a bit. But using these assets does work very well, and I'll come back into using these a little bit later on, but I'm going to build the scene with Forester for now. I tend to use Megascans a lot more for nearly all of the flowers. I tend not to use Forester for that very much, but we'll come back around to this. But for now, we're just going to focus on building the scene, as none of this is going to work or look nice without the scene being in a good place first. So let's drop in a landscape. Now with the landscape, there's a couple of things I like to do here. So let's drop in a cube, and then let's have a look at the scale of that. I want to scale this up so the cube is quite small. Not too small, but decently small. I'm going to turn off my work plane. I'm going to drop in a camera. Make that 200 millimeters. Coordinates, we'll zero it out and push it away. So now we're like away from the landscape like this. And just use the cube as a bit of a focal point for a second. Press F2, cameras, perspective, that switches us to the different views so we can move about. What I'm going to do here is get a bit of variation on the landscape. We just want something a little bit different. To what comes in by default, and I'm going to kind of push this off to the side a bit. Have a look at that. I just want there to be a bit more roughness about it. Maybe bring in a bit more scale. And then what I'm actually going to do is we're going to duplicate this and push it off to the side. So I'm going to create this like little bridge with a gap in the middle in between the two terrains. So this is like quite a nice way to almost get like a valley. And I do this a lot when I want to kind of place an object in the middle of it. And you can see now that already just from this basic ambient occlusion that's in the scene, that we have something that has that similar compositional setup to in the image that I'm trying to recreate. And that looks quite nice. So we can stick with something like that for now. I'm going to smooth this out a bit though, because it was a bit too rugged. And we shouldn't really have to do that too much. Now I'm just going to, before we scatter anything, I'm going to set up lighting. So let's turn off this top dot on the Octane sky. Make it black, and that can be our shadows. And then we can duplicate it. Call this one sky. Set it to visible environment and make it like grey. And group these together, these landscapes. Alt G. Call them landscapes. Duplicate it again. Open it up. Press C, make it editable. Connect objects and delete. And we can delete the cube as well. Next up, let's grab a light. It's Octane area light. Right click, animation tags, target. Let's target that new landscape. And then I just want to see where the camera is. So let's now push the light off to the side. And then let's grab a Forester multiflora. We'll go to a multiflora library. And you can see we have these different grass setups. So first I'm just going to grab the grass patch, just the standard one. I'm going to push this way out. And I'm going to go to objects, Octane scatter. We'll drop that in there, set it to surface, and drop in our landscape. You can see we've got a bunch of grass coming in now. Set that to 10,000. See what it looks. Do 20. And do 30. So 30 seems to cover them up nearly entirely. I'm going to set the power of the light to 1,000 as well. I want a pretty overpowering light. And I am actually going to rotate the landscape too. And then sometimes Octane scatter doesn't completely catch up, so you have to give it a little bit of a memory jog. Just make sure that those landscapes are turned off there so we can't see them. And then I'm going to place this light off to the side a bit more. While still lighting the front. Maybe rotate this back a bit. I can maybe lower the focal length actually, just because of the scale. And getting a bit closer might be conducive here to the actual scene. Just making sure this light is lighting up everything nicely. But we can't get too lost in this right now, because we're not really going to get anything that looks nice with the way it looks. So let's, holding Alt, go to Molecraft Effector Random. Let's drop in a random. That doesn't by default put it in the effectors tab, so we have to do that. And then we're going to come into that, turn off the position, go to rotation, and just yank up the H. And now we have a bunch of rotation variation. But there's something else we have to do. Is by default these are all the same scale. Now we can mess with the scale a little bit in the random effector, but it generally does it in quite a uniform fashion, and it's quite hard to get any good results out of it. So before we do that, what I'm going to do is you can delete everything here but this first material, and you go to materials, convert materials. But we're not going to use this one. Now we have our Octane material. All I'm going to do is use this to grab this image texture. So we can go to materials, create, and let's create a composite material. And in that material, add material 1, add material 2. And this is a very, very age-old trick at this point to get a good looking blade of grass. Is we'll plug that into material 1 and we'll plug it into material 2. Material 1 is going to be shiny. Material 2 is going to be translucent. We're going to create a float texture between both the materials, and that's going to give us a look that's transmissive but also reflective. So in the first material, Let's bump up the roughness quite a lot. And then in the set, and then let's add a color correction to material 1. And that can go into material 2 as well. But then let's add a color correction, and that can go into, we set this to diffuse, the transmission of this material. So now holding Alt, we can override that first material, and we're on our new material now, and you can see it's shiny, and it looks a lot nicer. So we're at about 0.5 right now, and you can see if I go up to 1, we're translucent. If I come down to 0, we're shiny. So we're going to sit in between the both of them. Now, this kind of shade of green, I don't find to be very realistic, so I'm actually going to desaturate a little bit, and we're going to drop down to a slightly more autumn shade of green. And you kind of need to do this on the color correction that goes into the transmission too, and also this gamma slider will heavily change how translucent things look. So we'll come back and play with this a lot, but for now, we have a material that looks somewhat realistic. Now let's go back to that scale that I spoke about. So let's go to the scale and let's add in a noise. And this is where everything comes to life in terms of making these nature scenes. No matter where we're scattering it, this is where it comes to life. So what I'm going to do for this one is we're going to just bring up the brightness quite a lot. We don't want much variation. We just want things to be a little bit varied. We don't want too much of that. You can increase the scale a bit, and you can kind of see those patterns revolving around. And that's where our power is to create a good looking nature scene. So I want you to think about that a lot over these next few tutorials. And we can tighten this up, for example, and then that's how you could create almost patches of fields and whatnot. And then if you bring down that brightness again back to 0% and clamp up the contrast, you can end up getting really, really tight patches, which is where we get a lot of power and ability to art direct. Because for example, with this alone, is if I wanted the long grass in these white areas, well, all I have to do is duplicate this, come in here, increase the length, come down here, come in here, slap there isn't an invert button on the default noise shader, but I can make this top color white and this bottom one black, which inverts it. And now we have long grass in those white areas. So you can see how we can use that to get a lot of control over what we're doing. So we're going to delete that for now. And I'm just going to make something that looks nice-ish. Nice-ish, preferably. Quite nice. Bring it in the scale. I just want a bit of variation here. But this is going to help a lot is if I actually duplicate the grass patch. And then in this grass patch, you come down here, you take a look at it. And if you're doing this with mega scans, this is where you can just use a different one. It's because I can increase the node count, and then I could increase the radius a little bit. I can increase the length. And then I could randomize the length a bit more to get it slightly more wild. I'll maybe keep the length quite tame. Now we have two different variations that are... This is actually a bit too similar, so I'm going to tighten this up a bit more and then bring out the length. I quite like that. And you can actually just mess with the seed a couple of times too. But what's really, really going to sell this variation is if I duplicate that first material, put it on the second grass patch. Now you can see for a second there where that is. Don't know why it's gone white, but it has done. So now if we come in this material and just mess with this to get it to go green again. What I'm going to do now is slightly shift the color even more. And that is what really, really, again, helps, makes it look like a real nature scene, is slightly different colors in the grass. But an issue right now that's holding the scene back is the count. So you can sit and mess with the noise all day and you can struggle to art direct it. But you kind of need to really, really lift up the count. And then at that point, that's where your noise is actually going to allow you to have a decent amount of power with it. So... like I've mentioned, I'm really not too interested in doing much besides increasing variation here in their lengths. So to do that, we're going to keep the high clip quite low, I want to say. Mess with the contrast a bit. Mess with the low clip. No, we don't want to mess with the contrast actually. Increase the scale quite a lot. We'll settle for something like this, but then I'm going to bring the scale up in the random to about 0.5. And then I'm just going to bring up my resolution to 2560 by 1440. It's really useful for creating grass scenes so we can actually see what's going on. You can see now with a bit more clarity. Now this is looking okay, but there still isn't that scale variation that I want. And that's when we just have to play. Can maybe mess with a much smaller noise. And now we're starting to get something a little bit. But I don't like these 0%. So I'm going to make sure the brightness is quite high so that we're not seeing the ground very much. And we'll come back to that. For example, a good solution here can just be to add a glossy texture. A lot of people seem to think when creating nature scenes that you need some sort of really advanced ground material, and we can come back to that later, but a good placeholder can be just to create a brown material that can kind of hold over as dirt. So now we actually have something decent. There is some sort of variation in the grass, and we can just see the work that's going on here. We can copy that. In fact, we don't need to copy it, but we can store that and then clear it, and we can just see what our noise is doing for us. And you can see it's giving us that variation, which looks really nice. I'm going to just paste that back in. I'm going to work on lighting and scene and kind of Lookdev the scene a little bit. So in this sky material, I'm going to make this a slightly darker gray for a second. And I'm going to add a Octane camera tag, enable it, enable Ace's tone mapping, overexpose the scene. A little bit of post. When I say a little bit, I mean a little bit. And then and go for a slightly smaller light on a higher power. So maybe have a look at about a power of 10,000. And then I'm going to move this light further away and lower down. And I want quite a few more shadows here, especially around the front. Something somewhat like this, I think, is nice. It's much more aggressive lighting. And then we can lift our shadows quite a bit more. And then that's going to compensate for this grey spot here. Now, I think one thing that's going to help this scene a lot is a gradient. So we'll come to that in a minute. But I'm just going to mess with a couple different camera angles. And this is something that's quite a vicious part of my workflow when creating nature scenes, is just duplicating cameras and moving them about. Because these are scenes where the composition seems to be very, very sensitive. And duplicating the camera and shifting it about is something that I tend to do a lot. So I'm just going to turn on that old landscape for a second. Seeing where that is. So if you put that in the same position here, duplicate it again, I am actually just gonna mess with these a bit. So in this first one, I'm gonna fine that out a lot. Make it less rough. I'm gonna do that in the first one too. And then if you combine them again, I think I like that a little bit more. Just something that looks a bit more smooth. Okay, so this is alright. I quite like what I'm looking at here. We're making our way to a render, and we're only 20 minutes in. Now, I tell you what, I wasn't initially going to do this, but let's actually go for this look. Let's get this kind of grayed out look. Because I think it's good to understand how much we can art direct here. So let's go for grass underscore 001. And let's go for grass underscore 002. And then let's desaturate that on the first node and on the second node. but not too much. You still want like a tiny bit of greenness there. And then in the second material, let's do the same thing in both of them. But I'm going to increase the gamma on both of them and make it a little bit lighter. Just a touch. Let's have a little look at that. That's nice, but they're both very, very white. And there's actually too much green, I want to say. So I'm going to decrease the saturation. And then maybe I don't want the gamma up so much. I do apologize if this tutorial is a little volatile to follow. Unfortunately, that's just kind of how creating nature scenes goes. And it is nice here, but I just want a little bit more obvious color variation. So I'll maybe increase the gamma of the first one. So then there's a bit more jump between the dark and the light. And we can maybe increase towards the transmissive one a little bit more here and decrease the specular. And then now the shiny blades of grass are tempted to become a little bit more rare, which is going to be quite nice as well. And not every single blade of grass is going to be this hyper shiny blade of grass. So we can come back to these different angles, see how the scene's holding up. Now I mentioned a gradient on the background, so we can do that by coming here. Let's drop in a Octane gradient on the background. Set it to linear. Just increase the scale. Sorry, decrease the scale. Set it to 90 degrees. And then when we have something like that, that looks quite a bit nicer in the background. Overexpose a bit more. I can even see we can bring most of that color back in if we actually just hypersaturate the scene. I tend to vignette a little bit on nature scenes. And let's have a look at this light here, because there is a little trick that I might do. I'm pretty happy with the lighting for the most part. But what we could do is if we duplicate this light, we could potentially put another light way out the back here. That could just act as a bit of a rim light. You can kind of see the work that I was doing there. But I feel like that kind of overdoes it a bit. I like my dark shadows. So the sampling rate to 248. And honestly, this is a pretty good scene, but the only thing I'm not happy with is the color and the bumpiness of everything. And then we're going to come back to the variation again to finish off. So the color, we've got a little bit too much greenness in one of them, and then the other one is far too white. So I want quite a darkness about them. Something like this is kind of on the similar tracks to what I represented in that Xbox render. I'm going to do the same thing here. It's looking a bit better. And this is a very, very art-directed scene, but I think that's good to do with nature. I don't think you always need to keep it all super neat. We're going to come back into the variation again in a second. But I'm going to mess with the bumpiness again of the terrain. I know I already did this once, but I'm just going to do it again. Apparently I've deleted my ground material, so I'll just drag in a new one sooner or later. Leave it white for now. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to just turn off the scatter for a second actually. I can delete that, duplicate these. I just want to get rid of that bumpiness that it has. So I'm guessing decreasing the scale is going to help a bit with that. Something a bit like that. Let's see how that looks. Okay, I like that a lot more. So this is actually now showing how much variation we have coming from the noise. I think there was a little bit of a dance before between the grass and the terrain being so rough. So my mistake, I probably should have kept that a bit softer at first. So I'm going to try and smooth it out a little bit. I think that about does the job. We have these dark patches now, which looks really nice. We want these kind of streaky clumps. And we want something a little bit like that. Let's come away from this and create like a 300mm angle. Come off to the side. That looks nice. Very much happy with that, but I feel tempted to straighten up the composition, so I'm going to zero out all of this and get ourselves in the center of the world. And then I'm going to rotate this landscape along with the light. I'm probably just going to have to reposition the light. I'm going to rotate these to the side a bit. And then bring the light to the side with them. I'm going to create a couple different camera angles now. Trying to stay as centered in the world as possible. Probably going to come off of this angle a little bit more, if anything. Okay. Let's do one more. Yeah. Okay. This works for now. I'm going to bring down the shininess of the material a bit again. Just don't want it too glossy. Bring down the specular a bit. So that shine is there, but not too over the top. So there's kind of a little introduction to just building somewhat of a nature scene. I'm kind of wishing I got closer to this soft composition, which, now when I'm thinking about it, could have just been off the back of one terrain, but I think it's good to learn how to balance out multiple. But what I will do is I'll save this and save a second one. Let's just work with one terrain for a second, just for the purposes of being able to art direct this on a whim, and being able to change the makeup of this terrain without it being an editable object. As if we do keep these segments low, you can see now that of course we have the ability to keep changing it and altering the composition. So maybe we don't do borders at sea level. We mess with the seed until we get something like a valley. I don't really like that, actually. There you go. Kind of got lucky there. You can see there's a lot more ability to mess with what's going on now. So that probably should have been the direction I took at the beginning, rather than binding both the landscapes together. We can delete that. See how much we can simplify this, what different looks we can get. It's nice to see so many different looks so quickly. I certainly think that for an early process of creating a nature render, now this is a good direction to take. See, I like that. That looks cool. So maybe rotate that, get it a bit more centered. It's very nice. And then if we were to look at the gradient, could add a little bit of greenness into that. Not that much. Mess with the scale, try and get the gradient looking a bit more obvious. And maybe you flip those and you have the light at the bottom and then the dark at the top. You have a nice little art-directed nature scene regarding, again, the bumpiness. And you can maybe get away with scaling that up a little bit. And you have something that looks nice there. I'm going to conclude that there because there is so much more we can do and so many more places that we can take it. And I do apologize that there is a slightly unorthodox tutorial to make. I'm not a fan of such a cluster of a workflow and going back and forth so much. I know it's difficult to follow, but there is certain workflows in Cinema 4D or kind of in any realm of 3D motion graphics in general that generally take a lot of tweaking, and you're kind of flexing these muscles of dipping back and forth between different parameters and different settings and learning kind of where you've got things that are a bit useless and what's playing into the strengths of the scene a lot, and knowing when that you might need to tweak your lighting, or then when it might be the camera, or then when it might be the landscape, or whatever's posing issues. So what we're going to go into the next time in part 2 is I'm going to go over applying ground textures, and then we're going to go over in fact, we might not do ground textures in the next one. I think it's going to be more about variation and bringing in more than one Octane scatter, so we can bring in different lengths of grass and different variation like flowers and whatnot. And then what we can do is keep building to the point that we're building ground textures and putting in rocks in the scene and allowing it to become a lot more complex in general. So whether I'll do that in the same scene that I've got right now or build entirely new scenes each time, I'm not sure yet, but I think this is a good place to start, and then that will save us having to, and save me having to redo the lighting and everything from the beginning again. So I might just continue to build on this scene, although I do really, really respect the simplicity of this. Maybe we can make a little naughty daily render. We'll put a cube up there, give it a fillet. You see this? This would get me so many likes on Instagram. Give it a metallic material. Make it rough. Drop the specular. Whoa. There's your daily render for the week. That's about all for this part. I know it was actually a bit more complicated than this in the end, but surely just by that we understand what's going on here. You understand how this has been made. You know, the scaling was a little bit different, and I really should have just stuck with one landscape, but you get the gist of things now, and we can keep building on that and keep creating new scenes.